Welcome to everyone. I'm James Jensen, today's webinar chair. I am a contractor supporting the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs Tribal Energy webinar series. Today's webinar, titled Energy's Role in Resilience Planning, is the second webinar of the 2021 DOE Tribal Energy webinar series. Let's go over some event details. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available on DOE's Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs website in about 1 week. Copies of today's presentation slides will be posted to the Office of Indian Energy's website shortly after this webinar. And I think actually they're already posted and the link has been sent out to the audience. Everyone will receive a post-webinar email with the link to the page where the slides and the recording will eventually be located. Because we are recording this webinar, all phones have been muted. We will answer your written questions at the end of the final presentation. You can submit a question at any time by clicking on the question button located in the webinar control box on your screen and typing your question. Let's get started with some opening remarks from Lizana Pierce. Ms. Pierce is a senior engineer and the deployment supervisor for the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs duty station here in Golden, Colorado. She oversees the deployment program, which is national in scope. Specifically, the deployment program includes financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and outreach. She also implements national funding opportunities and administers some of the resultant tribal energy project grants and agreements. She has over 25 years of experience in project development and management and has been assisting tribes in developing their energy resources for the last.
James, did you go on mute?
No. Can you hear me?
Okay, now I can.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
She pursued a master's in business administration through the University of Northern Colorado. Lizana, the virtual floor is now yours.
Thank you, James, and hello, everyone. I join James in welcoming you to today's webinar. This webinar series is sponsored by the Office of Indian Energy Policy and Programs, otherwise referred to as the Office of Indian Energy. The Office of Indian Energy promotes Indian energy development, efficiency, and use, helps to reduce or stabilize energy costs, enhance and strengthen Indian tribal energy and economic infrastructure, and brings electric power and service to Indian lands and homes. To provide this assistance, our deployment program partners with Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages to overcome the barriers to energy development. Our deployment program is composed of a three-pronged approach, including financial assistance, technical assistance, and education and capacity building. And this webinar series is just one example of our education and capacity building efforts. Specifically, the webinar series is intended to provide attendees with information on tools and resources to develop and implement tribal energy plans, programs, and projects, to highlight tribal energy case studies, and to identify business strategies tribes can use to expand their energy options and develop sustainable local economies. This webinar series is focusing on how tribal energy projects can improve community resilience, foster economic development, and support environmental stewardship. In the second webinar of the series, we will look at the significance of energy on community resilience. Today's webinar builds off of the last month's webinar, which looked at climate change related to impacts on tribes and tools and resources available to help reduce and manage those impacts. If you missed the last webinar, you can find a recording of it and many other past webinars on our website. Excuse me. We do hope that this webinar and the series as a whole is useful to you, and we welcome your feedback. So please let us know if there are ways we can make the series better. You can send any feedback to our main email at indianenergy@hq.doe.gov. Before I turn it back to James, I did want to personally thank the presenters for giving us their time and preparing for and for presenting on today's webinar. Thank you all. And with that, the virtual floor is yours, James.
Thanks, Lizana. Before we get to the presentations, I will introduce all of today's presenters. For our first presentation, we'll hear from Eliza Hotchkiss. Eliza is a senior resilience analyst leading the Resilient System Design and Engineering Group within NREL's Energy Security and Resilience Center. Her areas of expertise include disaster recovery, resilience and sustainable development, with a focus on analysis and outreach to increase deployment of resilient technologies and best practices within infrastructure systems and communities. She leads resilience assessments for federal, state, local, and tribal governments and provides technical assistance for internal resilience and sustainable development. Following Eliza, we will hear from Jana Gagnon. Jana is the Sustainability and Government Affairs Director for the Blue Lake Rancheria, where she has established the tribe's strategy for zero carbon resilience and sustainability. Her development experience includes low carbon microgrids, electric vehicle infrastructure, strategic planning and sustainability, climate action, both mitigation and adaptation, emergency preparedness, and economic enterprise development. She is an appointee to the U.S. Department of Energy's Indian Country Energy and Infrastructure Working Group, the U.S. Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, California Task Force, California's Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resilience Technical Advisory Committee, and California AB 617 Consultation Group, and the California SB 350 Disadvantaged Communities Advisory Group for the California Public Utilities Commission and California Energy Commission. I don't know how she has enough time to join us today, but she's here and we're thankful for that. Jana works on policies, programs, and investments to achieve rapid, cost-effective transition to decarbonized and resilient communities. Our final presentation will be from Stephanie Krantz. Stephanie is the Climate Change Coordinator for the Nez Perce Tribe, where her focus is adaptation planning, climate change mitigation, and protecting biodiversity and cultural diversity in a changing climate. She received her master's degree from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment in 2005, where she studied agricultural ecology and biodiversity. She has worked for the private, public, and nonprofit sectors throughout her career on planning and endangered species conservation. She lives in Clarkston, Washington with her family. Thanks to each of our presenters for making the time to join us today. With that, let's get started with our first presentation. Eliza, you may proceed once your slides are up.
Great, thank you so much, James, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on where you are. As James mentioned, my name is Eliza Hotchkiss, and I'm a Recovery and Resilience Analyst within NREL's Energy Security and Resilience Center. Next slide, please, Monica. Thank you. So just to give a little bit of context, for those of you who might not be familiar with NREL and what we do, we are the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, but we do a lot more than just renewable energy research and development. We are one of the 17 laboratories in the Department of Energy's lab system, and we focus on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other energy challenges. So what I'm talking to you about today is really just one piece of a lot of research that's going on across the lab, and it's all related to energy and overcoming a lot of the current energy challenges. Next slide, please. And so I'm really staying at a high level with this presentation because you've got some great presenters after me that are talking about very specific examples of addressing energy challenges with resilience projects. So just setting some context for today's webinar, I think it's important to remember that we often have a grid that was designed for past conditions. It was designed to generate power and then to move that power from the generation plant to transmission and distribution to an end load. So this required very limited communications and was managed in a very different way. Next slide, please. What we're seeing now is that the grid is changing, and this will all make sense in a little while. But we and other national labs within the DOE lab system are supporting research and trying to understand the different types of energy that can be used, or sources of energy that can be used in different locations, different conditions, how energy can be stored, but then how you can actually be more of a prosumer rather than just a consumer and have smart controls or use your electric vehicle to help store energy. There are so many different options, and we're really interested in what the grid now looks like, but then also what the grid of the future will look like, because that really is going to help us understand new vulnerabilities and new risks to the grid system and to the way that we use energy, so that we can start to understand different resilience solutions that can be incorporated at different scales. Next slide, please. So I think many of us are familiar with natural hazards that have been occurring very recently, and really help to emphasize that it's important for us to have reliable and resilient electricity supplies, not just for convenience and for our livelihoods, but for community safety and really to keep communities prospering under all sorts of conditions. I'll give you a couple examples in the next few slides of where we've seen some really devastating impacts. This one is a little farther afield for most of us, but in 2017, there were two hurricanes, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, which occurred in very quick succession. And so people couldn't recover from Hurricane Irma before Hurricane Maria made landfall. We've seen how this has impacted the Caribbean islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And unfortunately, Puerto Rico is a good lesson in what can happen if the grid is not prepared to withstand really extreme events. The picture on the left is of a grid system that was taken out by high winds, and the picture on the right is of solar photovoltaic panels that were unfortunately destroyed by high winds as well during these two storms, Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And it took 11 months to restore power, which at the time made it the largest blackout in U.S. history. So it really has a significant impact to these communities. And what we're interested in our work is how to prevent this type of impact in the future when there is another storm of the same type or size. Next slide, please. So I think Jan is going to talk a little bit more about this slide, but just to emphasize that every year NOAA collects data on the natural hazard and climate hazard related events that occur and the impact in terms of dollars associated with each of those events. And every year we see that the annual billion-dollar weather and climate disaster level is increasing. So this image is from 2020, and you can see that the disasters really do range in type and scale, but they have different levels of outage duration, which I want to talk about on the next slide. So there are two things that really do impact whether or not a community is able to survive an outage. And those come down to the number of events that we're seeing and the duration of those outages. It's variable across the country. It really does vary depending on the types of natural disasters or climate-related events that are being experienced in different geographic locations. But then it also does depend on grid stability. As we've seen, there are a lot of vulnerabilities in our grid infrastructure. We have an aging grid. I think it's something like 70% of our grid system is over 100 years old. And so when these extreme weather events or climate change related events occur, it exposes the vulnerabilities in those systems. So what we saw in Texas is a great example. There were rolling blackouts, which caused a combination of record high demand and also reduced generation from generation plants being removed from the generation mix by several cold weather related issues. So what we're seeing is that extreme weather events historically have driven grid reliability, but we really need to examine more extreme events and their impacts on the power system, because we're seeing more of these blackouts occurring and the duration is lasting a lot longer. So it's really important for us to identify this as a need, to understand, and to start coming up with solutions that can address a lot of these challenges. Next slide, please. So coupled with those natural disasters, which are really short-term, immediate impacts, we are really interested in long-term impacts as well. And so the pictures that you see here, the one on the left on the bottom is from Shishmaref, Alaska. I think a lot of us are familiar with this example of how increasing storm surge and erosion and coastal erosion are really impacting the community. And a lot of communities in this type of situation are looking at relocation and trying to relocate in a way that will mean that they can stay in a given location for a much longer period of time. The example on the right on the bottom is from Ile de Jean Charles, Louisiana. And again, there is a lot of climate change related observations in this community, and this community is actively involved in a relocation exercise now. And unfortunately, these are just two examples of where we're seeing long-term climate change related impacts occurring and impacting food and lifestyles and communities, and also infrastructure related to energy, water, communications, and transportation. So a lot of the infrastructure sectors and systems that support livelihood and economic feasibility and survivability in different communities. For those of you who are interested, the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit has a really great set of tools that might be helpful for all of you. And they have a lot of different assessments and analyses that are on that website that can provide you with a lot of detailed information. So a great resource. So what I wanted to point out here is there are a number of different examples of resilience planning that exist at the state, community, and federal levels, as well as within tribal nations. There are a lot of existing models and tools that could help to identify what the greatest risks to energy and infrastructure systems are, and then how to prioritize those solutions and implement those solutions. So it's not necessary to start from square one. I think what you're going to hear from Jana and from Stephanie are examples of where this has been done, and hopefully it will be inspirational and you can take away some of the lessons that they've learned through their processes and understand what might be applicable within your community. But what I really want to emphasize here is what works in one location might not always work in another location. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to resilience. It really does need to be a stakeholder-driven process that addresses the risks specific to your individual communities. So it's great to share these lessons, but keep in mind that what works at Cape Cod National Seashore might not necessarily apply to the Quinault Indian Nation. Next slide, please. And similarly, a lot of the work that we do at NREL is not just on renewable energy. We also look at sustainable transportation, energy efficiency, and energy systems integration. I would say that even though you might be focusing on how energy can be uninterrupted and be more resilient within a specific community, there might be a lot of different ways to achieve the same end result. And resilience is going to look very differently within each of the communities. Usually when we're doing resilience planning on the ground with communities, we ask what people think of when they think of resilience, and we never get the same answer twice. Even within the same community, everybody has a different definition of resilience. And so the solutions similarly can be very broad and include a lot of different types of technologies, or practices. They can be operational resilience, building capacity and understanding of resilience within the community, but also using different types of technologies and solutions to enhance resilience. So a few examples of where you could use these different principles and technologies to really build out and address resilience within communities are shown on the next few slides by infrastructure type. So the first is energy, and we're doing a lot of research right now on how energy efficiency can enhance resilience. But this is just one example of energy efficient buildings, for example, can be used not just to lower energy bills on a regular basis, but they can also help with sheltering in place. If you have design principles incorporated into buildings that enhance passive survivability, so occupants don't need to leave and they can use the buildings as a safe haven during some sort of disruptive event, that's really going to provide a safety zone, but also help longer term with lowering energy bills. Similarly, a lot of the work that we do, and I think Jana is going to talk a little bit more about some of the microgrids, we have a number of solutions around distributed energy resources. So if you have a microgrid that's connected to the grid but is islandable and can provide power during a grid disruption, that can be used to serve critical loads or more vulnerable communities or neighborhoods, so that you're helping to alleviate the need for community members being displaced. You're able to provide critical services during a grid disruption. So these are just two examples within the energy sector. Next slide, please, Monica. Similarly, I think a lot of us don't really think beyond just having power and forget that there are a lot of interdependencies between these different infrastructure sectors. And one example came out of Hurricane Sandy, where some natural gas fleets were able to operate during the power outages that lasted about 3 weeks on the East Coast because they had the ability to pump fuel to their vehicles. And so those vehicles then became emergency vehicles and helped to transport people in need of being transported. What we forget a lot of times is that gasoline fuel distribution needs power to actually pump the gasoline. And so when you lose power during a disruptive event as a result of a grid outage, you don't have the ability to refuel your vehicles. Another solution that we're seeing in a few communities is including hardened infrastructure, reinforcing bridges, and using different types of fuel within vehicles like electric vehicles, and making sure that there are emergency routes that are walkable to allow for different options and for hardened infrastructure that really help alleviate congestion and provide mobility for people who need to have mobility during disruptive events. So just two more infrastructure sectors to cover. One is water. Looking at water conservation and storage can be helpful for enhancing resilience. If you're able to reduce the amount of water that you're using within a building and you have on-site water storage, or in some locations you're able to do rainwater harvesting, those can help with a grid disruption because what we often forget is that we need power to treat and to pump water. And so if you have things like gravity-fed systems and you can pump water in advance of a known disruptive event, that type of solution can help with distributing water where it's needed, when it's needed. And then similarly, green infrastructure is something that is incorporated and being incorporated in a lot of communities. to use natural vegetation or bioswales to reduce localized flooding that is associated with storms and can slow runoff rates so that you're not causing downstream impacts as a result of extreme precipitation or rain events, just as examples. So these are three different solutions that we're seeing being implemented in a number of communities. And then finally, I think this was illustrated, unfortunately, a couple weeks ago, that cybersecurity is really important. Making sure your IT and communications networks are secure to avoid hacking is going to ensure that those systems are operational when you need them. But then also having analog backup systems and controls or redundant nodes to help with redundancy really enhances the resilience of communications networks, so that if one system goes down, you might have another system available to provide that backup. So ensuring that your distributed energy resources, your critical facilities are secure is really important, but then also having some of those analog systems, walkie-talkies often are a solution, or ham radios can be incorporated to provide additional communications networks when our usual networks go down. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just one example of where I think this is an interesting story, where a community has incorporated resilience through some disaster recovery efforts. This is in Galena, Alaska, and for those of you not familiar with Galena, in 2013, they were impacted by a flood on the Yukon River that shot ballistic ice out of the river, and it damaged about 90% of the community within Galena. And so the residents were forced to evacuate. I think there were nearly 500 residents who needed to evacuate during the floods. But when they were coming back to the community, they decided to incorporate energy efficiency measures, which you see on the bottom right, and also a biomass system to help reduce the vulnerabilities that they have within the community. So you can see the building on the right is being raised above a base flood elevation level so that it's more protected if there is a future flood event. But then energy efficiency is also being incorporated into the building envelope so that it's reducing the need for additional power and fuel. And what's interesting is that Galena, Alaska on average, spends 67 cents a kilowatt hour for power. And so any energy efficiency measure that can be implemented is going to reduce those costs to the community members and to the residents. And then the biomass power plant is in a lot of ways is an upgrade because it's a newer system, and is also reducing the need for fossil fuel to be imported. It's barged in the summer when the river is open and not frozen over. And that's another reason that the cost of power is so high in Galena, 67 cents a kilowatt hour. So just an example really quickly of where resilience is being incorporated and thinking ahead to future conditions and what can be improved now to benefit residents. And then finally, as I mentioned, we all have different definitions for resilience. If you ask community members, they might have a different solution, or different definition, even within the same community. And the examples that I've provided today relate to the ability to anticipate, prepare for, and adapt to changing conditions so that communities are able to withstand and respond to different disruptions, but also recover rapidly. And one way that we integrate this work is through adaptable and holistic planning and technical solutions. So this is on our resilience roadmap. If you'd like more information, that should be a live link that you'll be sent at the end of all of the presentations today. And that might be another resource that might be helpful to all of you. And I believe that's my last slide, Monica. So I will hand it over to Jana. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Eliza. Excellent presentation, a lot of interesting stuff, and tying in the transportation and water issues related to grid outages is obviously a very important takeaway. Yeah, with that, Jana, as soon as your slides are up, I think you can proceed.
Okay, I just want to do a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you sound great.
Yeah.
Terrific, thank you. Well, that is a difficult presentation to follow because it's very good and comprehensive. I think it will dovetail, though, pretty well with what I'm going to talk about today. And in that, there's many different components to energy resilience planning and deployment. I just want to thank the DOE and the Tribal Webinar team for making these discussions possible and for recording these discussions so we can go back and review things that we maybe didn't catch the first time. I know I need to do that all the time. So I join you all from the ancestral lands of the Wiyot people. And as this first set of information sort of talks about, I'm going to talk about the planning context. So when planning for resilience, the Blue Lake Rancheria first clarified wrapping its arms around the full context in which it's developing clean energy. And this changes, but I think that there are some constant considerations that could be helpful. The full picture includes global, national, regional, and local items, and it's been crucial to the tribe's decision-making and investment project by project, and a key contributor to the tribe's successes in these areas. So as I'm taking us through the Blue Lake Rancheria's context, I'm hoping it will have many resonances for you all. So what is resilience? Well, of course, each tribal nation will have their own definition. For the Blue Lake Rancheria tribe, it means clean air, clean water, fulfilling and well-paying jobs, a strong economy, social services that are well-funded and work to improve lives. And around all of this, the nation is able to withstand issues and recover swiftly, ideally just as strong as it was going into the emergency and maybe even stronger. Resilience in our region, which is the Redwood Coast of Northern California, and more specifically Humboldt County, is collaborative. There are 8 tribal nations that have lands within the county boundary. There's a total of 140,000 people or so that live here. We're rural, we're geographically isolated. We're referred to as behind the Redwood Curtain. And what that means is a tenuous connection to energy grids, among other things. And with recent emergencies over the last couple of years, we've refreshed our understanding that energy helps support all that we do in typical and emergency circumstances. So we need to make it as reliable and as pollution-free in the community and for the climate as possible. Next slide, please. So in energy resilience planning, the tribe began centering the changing environmental conditions several decades ago. And with help with partners such as NOAA and NASA and NREL and the Department of Energy, we've been able to widen the information net to include global climate data and science. And of course, global warming and related issues make local issues larger and have combined and cascaded into multiple issues simultaneously, which is always fun. As one example, the oceans, which you see in this graph here, are warming at a dramatic rate. And this is an issue because they absorb about 90% of the global temperature increases. And when they don't absorb as much, the issues will become swiftly even more severe on land. We're already seeing local warm, what they call warm blobs in the Pacific Ocean that have damaged the traditional ecosystems and the species that tribes and others depend on. And of course, warming temperatures increase the energy in the weather. Tribes from all over the country have observed severe and unpredictable weather conditions, extreme storms, and other issues. Temperatures are rising in our rivers with tragic outcomes for species. As we speak right now, that's happening on the north coast of California. And many tribal nations are working in close collaboration with other agencies and experts to see what we can do to mitigate that damage. Temperatures are rising in our soils, which leads to issues with food, moisture content in plants, which of course means more wildfire smoke and related conditions. Next slide, please. And as Eliza mentioned, the climate crisis is expensive. 2020 held the highest rate of billion-dollar disasters from climate and weather in the United States ever. In addition to precious lives lost in these events, severe damage was done to infrastructure, including, of course, energy utilities. In 2021, the winter storm that hit Texas utilities caused economic damages of $140 billion and counting. Next slide, please. So we need to talk about heat and wildfires and wildfire smoke. All are increasing, amplified by the climate emergency. This photo is from September 11th, 2020, when the entire West Coast was on fire, with some of the largest wildfires ever recorded. And right now, as we're speaking, there are historically low fuel moisture content in forests, in other areas, and at woodland urban interfaces, which of course threaten our homes and our critical facilities, including energy infrastructure. Public safety power shutoffs are a tool in California to mitigate wildfires. They're planned outages to prevent wildfires from the electrical grid. And these are now annual, projected to last 2 to 10 days and be necessary for at least the next decade. We're seeing drought and wildfire, and of course wildfire smoke in new areas, like at the Blue Lake Rancheria, which is just 5 miles inland from the Pacific coast in a relatively very temperate area. Another example is the heat dome that happened over the entire Western United States in 2020. And this created rolling outages in California that were happening in addition to the PSPS events that year. These events take lives, they drain resources, and they impact our energy systems. Next slide, please. And again, I'm going to spend some time on context just to give you a window into how we plan and how we think about these things. And I know that everybody listening has their own unique and specific conditions, but all of those things are important to factor into your energy investment and decision making. So sea level rise impacts our region's energy infrastructure, as with many tribes, such as the Quinault Nation and others that we've talked about already. And it's not just sea level rise coming in from the ocean. Our groundwater tables are rising, and we are seeing increased flooding from storms as well. So our region, Humboldt County, is experiencing the fastest rate of sea level rise on the Pacific coast, and this is due to a combination of land subsidence and just sea level rise from the ocean. And this, of course, creates life-threatening impacts to local infrastructure, including the region's Anchor natural gas power plant and the adjacent local nuclear waste repository. We see these impacts to local infrastructure. We know we have a couple 2 to 4 to 5 decades to take action, but the planning and some of the deployment is starting now. Next slide, please. And just one other thing that we deal with here, as many tribes do that are near the Pacific coast, this region is at the triple junction of seismic faults just offshore, and one of the few areas in the world capable of creating a 9.0 or greater earthquake with a potential associated tsunamis. The entire Pacific coast may experience this kind of an earthquake at the same time, and reports are that we're about 100 years overdue for the big one. So we have that sort of sense of urgency as we prepare as well. Next slide, please. So this slide, and again, this will be considerations that are unique to each tribal nation, but this region shows this slide shows that this region is connected by one 10-inch natural gas pipeline. It runs through seismically active mountainous areas. It's vulnerable to rupture. And if that happens, not only will our residential and commercial use of natural gas be suspended for heating and cooking, but the Anchor natural gas electrical power plant will be out of service as well, which means the grid connected areas of the region will be without power. Next slide, please. This region is also served, as many tribes also experience, by one transmission line. We do have a redundant line, but both run through wildfire country and cannot be operated simultaneously. Further, they only provide half the region's electrical load as it stands now. The rest is generated by that one natural gas electrical power plant. In 2020, PG&E, our local investor-owned utility, put in some additional equipment and switchgear to turn the area in green in this photo into an islandable grid segment. And this is very much appreciated because it saved the region from PSPS events of 2020. But again, if that one power plant goes down, this grid island won't work either. So it's always good to know where your electrons are coming from actually. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? These contexts converge into a relatively simple strategy. We're transitioning to climate smart infrastructure as soon as possible, and we're prioritizing lifeline sectors. We're starting with energy and also water, communications, transportation, and of course, food. And when these are done well, a lot of benefits begin to stack up. Continuity of operations, economic supports, improvement in community health and other social services, increased employment, and a bunch of others, which I'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. The tribe has developed overarching goals to guide this work, pairing climate mitigation and adaptation to achieve zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, to make things better in the tribal community and for the region without making emissions, the causes of warming, worse as we deal with the impacts from those conditions. So we don't want to create a vicious cycle, we want to create a virtuous cycle. Next slide, please. So one of the results of the planning and the context is the deployment of low carbon electrical microgrids. Currently, the tribe has 2 in operation and 2 others in design. And by having a suite of microgrids clustered in one relatively small campus, it allows us to conduct ongoing research into how these systems can best operate, be improved upon, and we can study the economic investment and outcomes as well. Next slide, please. And before we get into the details of the microgrids, I want to mention the importance of strategic partnerships. Energy systems and microgrids can get complex, and once a tribe decides to build them, it's a perpetual effort. The tribe is small. Blue Lake Rancheria is pretty small in terms of membership and land base, so it partners for capacity that it needs. A key partner in this is our local university, Humboldt State University, which is soon to become Humboldt, well, Cal Poly Humboldt, which is a polytechnic. And the Schatz Energy Research Center is co-located at the university. We highly recommend this kind of strategic partnership with an educational institution for many reasons. But above all, I think the values between the tribe and a research and educational facility of knowledge sharing and long-term analysis and continual improvements are really built into the partnership. And it builds in an infrastructure ecosystem where younger tribal members can learn and play a role as well. So for its microgrids, the tribe has sourced funding from the California Energy Commission. So this enables and has resulted in a strategic partnership with the state on energy matters, and technical assistance from our local utility, with assistance from the DOE and our national lab partners as well, particularly NREL and Idaho National Lab, and also Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for another microgrid that I'll talk about in a moment. All the tribe's microgrids have the same basic characteristics. They can operate grid connected, and they can also seamlessly island from the grid and generate and use their own power for as long as needed. Then they can reconnect to the grid seamlessly as well. They use solar photovoltaics, lithium-ion battery storage, legacy basically pre-microgrid development diesel generators, which are now only used as a last resort. They include advanced building energy management systems, and they're coordinated with the microgrid controls that control the electrical infrastructure, which goes up to 12 kV. And all include electric vehicle charging stations as well. They are designed to achieve cost savings for the tribe, and they're designed to create greenhouse gas reductions at the same time. Next slide, please. So our facility scale microgrid, which we call Solar Plus, is at our fuel station and convenience store and was built as a replicable, low carbon, quote unquote, resilience package for these kinds of small commercial buildings. The details of the system are here for those that are interested, but one of the questions might be, why a gas station? The answer is, these facilities can supply all the lifeline sectors we're speaking of: energy, food, water, communications and connection to the internet, and of course transportation, but they can only do it, as Eliza mentioned, if they have power themselves. So this is very important where fuel station and convenience stores, which are common in tribal nations, are the only sort of public serving resource in the region with the ability to handle an emergency, as the Blue Lake Rancheria found out very specifically in 2019. Next slide, please. So on October 9th, 2019, we experienced our first public safety power shutoff in this region. And remember, these are proactive grid shutdowns. It's a catch-22. They had to shut down the grid to prevent wildfires because the conditions were such that it would have almost certainly been the case. The first event lasted about 30 hours in our region, but in other areas, several days. It was across 30 counties and millions of people in Northern California. When we received the first notification, the tribe opened up its emergency operations center. The microgrids islanded and provided power to the central campus. That enabled us to do a bunch of different things. We estimate that we served conservatively about 10,000 people, or 10% of the region, in under 30 hours. We supplied both the general public and emergency response agencies with power so that they could charge vehicles through electric vehicle charging stations, which, as Eliza mentioned, electric vehicles were then used to charge home refrigerators to keep food and medicines cold. Electricity was provided to charge communication devices, which is an important thing to think about, obviously, for many reasons. We provided gas and diesel. We provided power to those pumps, as Eliza mentioned, to get the gas in out of the tanks and into people's cars. And we supplied gas and diesel for emergency generators as well. We supplied lots of ice, water, food. As I mentioned, we provided internet connectivity and ATMs. Businesses were accessing the Wi-Fi from their cars in our parking lots, the paper of record published from a hotel room. We provided, probably most importantly of all of this, critical medical housing in our hotel. This is where people needed powered medical equipment for basic sustenance. And the local Department of Health and Human Services credited the tribe with saving 4 lives in that event. We provided refrigeration to keep food and, importantly, life-saving medicines like insulin cold. We opened a community support center, a business center, an education center. All of these things were possible because we had reliable and resilient power. And then in the heat dome event of August and September of 2020, we voluntarily islanded the microgrids to ease pressure on the regional grid, and we helped avoid major grid disruptions. It's important to keep power to evacuation support facilities like the tribe's hotel and its other shelter facilities to provide clean air shelters in wildfire events with air filtration to knock down both smoke and, of course, most recently, the COVID virus transmission. Next slide, please. So what are the lessons learned? As I mentioned, the PSPS events will continue for at least the next decade. Microgrids do work to improve resilience. They improve the tribe's ability to withstand issues and recover swiftly, which is one of our definitions of resilience. And we did that ideally, pretty ideally, in as good or better shape than we were in before the emergency. And the tribe now has confidence it can deliver the lifelines in most situations. But those outages have been relatively short. We know that if they last longer, and they likely will last longer, that we will have cascading issues. Chief concern is cellular and internet communications outages. This started happening at about the 24-hour mark in our first PSPS event. So what that indicated was that cellular towers, telecommunications infrastructure did not have adequate backup power. So we're working on that with our state and federal agencies. The drinking water and wastewater sewer systems in many cases failed to operate due to inadequate backup power. The tribe was very likely within 24 hours of losing its potable water supply from the adjacent city. And in response to that, we actually took action and have almost completed a smart emergency water grid to mitigate that, that situation. Our port had no power to unload gas and diesel out of tanker ships. So gas stations had no power. Plus, they couldn't restock except for deliveries that came in by truck. And those deliveries became unpredictable. The Blue Lake Rancheria tribe dealt with it with their own gas station with rationing, and that worked well. But it's a structural issue overall that we can't rely on one energy resource. And economic and social disruption, structure fires, loss of income, caring for infants, small children, elders, those that are medically vulnerable, and And in terms of resilience planning, these are considerations that have been very much heightened out of these recent events. Each tribe will have their own set of these, of course, and I'm hoping that these details have been useful in those considerations. Next slide, please. So when we talk about microgrids, they're complex. This slide gives considerations for tribes interested in developing those. I won't go into detail, only highlight that capacity in electrical skills, in engineering, in IT, both for construction and for the perpetual operation and maintenance, should be thought through very carefully. A lot of upfront work needs to happen in those areas to address what kinds of things the tribe can provide internally or wants to build internally, and what kinds of expertise they're going to need to resource from strategic partners. Energy efficiency and greater coordination of electrified buildings and EV charging are constant considerations. We are continually looking for ways to reduce electrical use up front and shift electrical use to better match with clean energy generation sources. That's really creative and interesting work, and it's really important to control costs on the back end. Also, the partnership with the connecting utility is something to start early and ensure thorough design of digital telecommunication connectivity. So what does your broadband infrastructure look like relative to the energy systems you want to build? This is important for remote access by equipment vendors to rural tribal nations where, in our case, we might be 6 hours away from our vendor and they can just remote in over the internet and fix our batteries or fix our inverters or do whatever they need to do. A lot of that stuff can be done remotely, but it can only be done if you have the proper digital connectivity. And cybersecurity is a piece of that as well that we won't have time to go into today, but it's important to keep on the list. Next slide, please. There's a couple slides here that are wraparound initiatives. So centering clean energy resilience has led to the development of really innovative education and training programs and a new center of resilience excellence that the tribe is currently building. The Arctic, the Resilience Training and Innovation Center, is our current approach to really thinking through contexts and providing training to increase local capacity so that local people can solve local problems. Next slide, please. This has some details on specific programs, including the Solar Workforce Training Program the tribe is especially proud of. This is a partnership with the DOE and Grid Alternatives that has led to just laser-focused solar career training that's led to key success stories. I'll just mention a couple because it's really important. One tribal member went on to get her dream job in a planning department with this training on her resume. Another underemployed tribal member working in the gig economy went on to work in a solar company and used part of their first paycheck to buy their first set of hand tools. Next slide, please. The Tomah Resilience Campus, Tomah means sun in the Wiyot language, is in construction and will be in an in-person and state-of-the-art virtual place to develop and launch solutions for clean energy and community resilience. We estimate the Tomah will be open in 2023. Next slide, please. So there is so much more to this than we can possibly cover today, but I just want to leave with a couple of additional points. The Blue Lake Rancheria tribe has been able to develop timely energy resilience by centering and respecting the conditions we see and working to make them better. The climate emergency data is proving correct and even conservative. This year is shaping up from a wildfire drought and hazards perspective to be even worse than 2020. Wildfire season here on the temperate Pacific coast started in early April. Undertaking the prioritized investment and hard decision making to create a manageable transition to clean energy and climate smart communities has created these just-in-time benefits. So I hope that the stories and the situational context has been useful. My contact information is here. Please don't hesitate to contact me to discuss any of these items further. I'm always happy to touch base on these. Thank you so much, and I will turn it back over to James and our hosts.
Thanks, Jana. An excellent presentation, as always, very insightful and thoughtful and relevant. We appreciate it. And there are some questions that have come in, so we'll get to those after this next presentation. The last presentation is from Stephanie Kranz. Stephanie, your slides are up, so you may proceed.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Jana, for that incredible presentation. The Blue Lake Rancheria has been an inspiration to us. And you know, we're just building our first microgrid, and so it's really amazing to see all the progress that you all have made. So this presentation, I'm going to focus on just a few key things that relate to the reasons why the tribe has chosen the direction that it's chosen with their solar energy development, and tells the story about what's happening here. When I first started here 4 years ago, Nikia Williamson, the director of cultural resources, told me, I said, you know, I'm the resilience coordinator, because I was a little bit nervous about calling myself the climate change coordinator at that time. And he asked me, what does resilience mean? And I tried to describe it. And he said, that doesn't make sense to me, because we are resilient. We are a resilient people. We have survived climate change in the past, and we will survive it in the future. And as the longer I've been here, the more I have understood just how incredibly resilient the Nimipu are, and determined they are to solve the problems that they face that are affecting their culture. Next slide, please. So the Nez Perce tribe is currently based near Lewiston, Idaho, in Lapwai. Lapwai means butterfly. It actually stands for the flapping wings of butterflies, the sound of the flapping wings. Central Idaho is where most of the Nez Perce tribe has the strongest treaty rights, but Nez Perce people traveled all the way from the mouth of the Columbia to St. Louis, Missouri, and throughout the Pacific Northwest. They fished, hunted, and gathered, and there's food trails and cultural sites throughout this area. They've lived here for about 17,000 years, maybe up to 25,000 years. The oldest Nez Perce village with radiocarbon dating is back to almost 17,000 years near Cooper's Ferry. But what that means is that they survived the end of the Pleistocene, the Ice Age floods, and this dramatic change in the climate in the past. And when the Bonneville flood happened, which on this map you can see the Snake River that passes by Boise and runs up through the Nez Perce tribe's territory, when that flood happened, it carved out the Columbia River Gorge and brought Pacific salmon inland to where people could regularly harvest it. And there's traditional stories about that event that are part of the oral history of the tribe. Next slide, please. The Nimipu consider themselves salmon people. And salmon is a huge part of the culture of the Nez Perce tribe, and much of the work that's been done in this region is to save salmon, because salmon have been impacted by many things: commercial fishing, invasive species, dams, logging, et cetera, et cetera. But fishing is strong today, and much of the investments of the tribe relate to fish habitat and fish protection. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, salmon are impacted by climate change across their full life cycle. You know, they're impacted by floods because their eggs are in gravel beds in streams. They're affected by mudslides that occur after fires because it buries eggs. They depend upon peak flows to get out to the ocean, and the timing of those flows matters, and the amount of water in the flows makes a big difference for how long it takes them to get to the ocean. Ocean acidification due to climate change is impacting young fish in the ocean. And then high stream temperatures are affecting the ability of salmon to get back upriver. So the Snake River headwaters for the average salmon is a 500 or 600 or 700 mile journey, if you can imagine. We're the furthest inland from the ocean and have some of the highest and coldest high quality habitat left in the Columbia River Basin. So the tribe is determined to help bring these fish back and to address the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So here's an example of some of the impacts that occur here during drought years. These photos are from 2015. You can see a fish weir with a dry creek bed with absolutely no water in it. Steelhead eggs in a gravel bed without any water. A lot of dead adult fish that died because of excessive heat and disease. And then a stream that has mud flows from wildfires that took off cover and topsoil and washed it down the river in the next precipitation event. Next slide, please. So one of the most interesting things about the tribe situation is that, you know, this region has abundant hydropower. There are dams on many of the rivers. Some of these dams provide most of the power that's used in the West. And in some cases, that power is extremely resilient. It works 24 hours a day. It also, you know, these dams are important for flood control as well. So some communities that might flood are not being flooded. But in the case of the Snake River dams, there's a controversy because the most inland Snake River salmon populations are doing the poorest of the salmon populations throughout the Columbia River Basin. So the average return goal has to be at least 2%, and we are not meeting that. But rivers that have fewer dams are doing really well. And so it would be, I think, a betrayal to not talk about this part of the story, that energy, the way that we think about energy and the environment is different for different people, and the impacts of our energy system are something that are very real and poignant for the Nez Perce tribe and many of the other salmon tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. One of the things that we did was interview elders and learn about what's happening here when it comes to climate change. We did community surveys, and then we interviewed a number of elders, And this particular interview was done by a photographer, Greta Ribas, who took this photo of Jeff Scott, who's an elder and a fisherman here at the Nez Perce tribe. And, you know, basically he summed it up better than almost anyone. There's no water. All the streams are smaller and smaller. They're finding out the dams, and the lack of salmon is even impacting the orca in the ocean. Everybody's connected, the cycle of life. It's really that way. It's not only the fish, it's everything. There's more fires, there's less food. We go digging and there's less to dig. It's our medicine and our food. A lot of it is closed off or it's not there. It's burned off or dug up, and there are wheat fields where there never used to be wheat fields. I'm scared for my children for what I've seen in my lifetime. There's going to be no fishing for them or no treaty rights. There's less and less for them. And this message was repeated by hundreds of tribal members that they're extremely worried about the impacts of climate change on their traditional lifeways, their culture, and on subsistence. And in this area, many people depend upon subsistence, hunting, fishing, and gathering, not just tribal members. And there's an incredible amount of poverty in the inland Pacific Northwest. So the abundance of the land is part of food security here. You know, the tribe has a food committee that's working on food sovereignty and is looking at many different ways of producing food in addition to looking at our energy system. But part of this story is the relationship of natural resources to cultural survival and resilience. Next slide, please. So the climate change staff looked at all sorts of data. It's impossible for me to cover it all now. Our vulnerability assessment will be out soon. And one of the most important areas that we looked at was, what is the evolution of these fish? You know, what is going on? What is the relationship of these fish to the climate? And I really like to depict this way because, you know, many people say that the climate has always changed, and therefore the changes that are happening today are not that extreme or aren't going to affect us that much. But this figure shows past climates and the temperature of the Earth. It shows, you know, the Pleistocene, the ice ages, and then the evolution of some of these fish. Lamprey are 450 million years old. There's a good chance that lamprey, given the right conditions and a reduction in barriers, will survive whatever climate we have in the future. Sturgeon, in the same way, are 200 million years old. They're extremely resilient fish. They're currently listed, but they may not be as sensitive to temperature as Pacific salmon, which are only about 6 million years old, evolved in a relatively cool climate and diversified in a cool climate. Bull trout, for example, are 1 million years old and evolved in a very cold climate. And, you know, we're looking at a scenario where in less than 100 years, we're going to have the climate of the dinosaurs, which is really alarming, especially when it comes to protecting these fish. With temperatures that are 7 to 10 degrees warmer throughout every part of the Nez Perce tribe's territory, we're really concerned about the effects of climate change on fish, to the point where the tribe wants to do everything that they can to solve the climate crisis. So their motivation for looking at their energy system is about more than just energy and supply stability and the lack of disruptions. It's about the disruption that the loss of salmon could cause to their culture. Next slide, please. In 2019, NOAA came out with their fish vulnerability assessments for the California current, and what we learned from that is that the species of fish that occur in the Snake River are highly sensitive and highly exposed, and therefore threatened by climate change. Next slide, please. So we started thinking about this more like, okay, what are our planning windows? How much time do we have to act, and what do we need to do? What does this mean for every part of our program when it comes to natural resources and energy? And of course, we looked at the IPCC 1.5 reports that show that to keep below 1.5 degrees Celsius from the current temperature, we have to basically curb emissions in the next 10 years. So we plotted out like what will the carbon in the atmosphere be by these dates in the next several decades, and what kind of trajectory do we want to be a part of, and started thinking about it in decades. What changes might occur and what can we do between now and then. And as you all know, it's very difficult to get a big project off the ground and to get it going. And so the urgency of figuring out how to act rapidly was really critical and is critical. Next slide, please. The other things that we looked at in terms of infrastructure were just where is all of our power supply and transportation, where are all of our bridges, where are our floodplains? And here's some maps from that exercise. The thatched orange areas are from fires that occurred in the 2015 drought. The blue lines are mostly rivers and canyon bottoms. The red lines are the major highways, and the pink is lots and lots of transmission lines. And in essence, what we found was everywhere on the reservation and in this region, almost all of the infrastructure, including the roads, the bridges, the railroads, and the transmission lines, are all in canyon bottoms, and therefore they are vulnerable to flooding, to mudslides and rock slides and landslides, to fires, and to power disruptions because it's all connected. And there's several main communities on the reservation. There's about 13,000 people living on the reservation, maybe 2,500 tribal members. And so there's very few good roads that are open year-round that allow for people to evacuate during emergencies. And where these fires occurred, they cut off some of those evacuation routes. And they also occurred where the major hubs of the power infrastructure is. Next slide, please. So here's some images that show the kind of flooding that we're experiencing here. We're having these exceptional late and early spring rain on snow events where more of the precipitation is coming as rain than snow, and it's choking culverts, washing out highways. This picture here of the truck with the floodwaters and all the rock is on Highway 12. The picture of the giant ditch with the mud, I don't know if you can see, but there's a tiny little person in this image, and it shows how an entire road washed out overnight, and basically all of the tribal members behind it were trapped if they didn't get out. This farm here with this big open cut bank, that was formerly a riparian area that was vibrant and thick and beautiful, and it washed out in a single event overnight, and the power poles on the river had to be relocated. So we're already seeing these effects on infrastructure, and this is a canyon and prairie system that has always experienced a lot of flooding, but it turns out that the best places to live are near the water, and almost all of our infrastructure is vulnerable to flooding. Next slide, please. The 2015 fires were a major event here. There had never been a fire emergency like that on the reservation. And, from these flood and fire events, we've seen how a lot of work needs to be done on emergency management and preparedness. Several tribal members lost their home in this event, and it all came together very rapidly. Next slide, please. So when we started looking at these impacts and talking to community members, we realized that this tribe really wants to be a part of solving the climate crisis and not just building in their own resilience. And we started looking at things like drawdown and the solutions projects and trying to understand, well, how long would it take to actually change the national energy system and the global energy system to solve the climate crisis. And what we realized is that this is possible and a lot of people are working on that. And I think because we're in Idaho, it's a conservative place and there isn't statewide planning for climate here yet, very few people understood that this is a problem that can be solved very rapidly. And because fish are so threatened by climate change, everyone here wants to do as much as they can as fast as they can. Next slide, please. So this just shows the results of our community survey, and we've started working on a lot of these things, and in some cases divisions of the tribe have been working on this for a really long time, but developing renewable energy sources was one of the #1 things that the community wanted. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that hydropower has a huge impact on salmon. We've also been thinking about what exactly is resilient energy. And for a tribe that's so focused on natural resources and natural resource conservation, where that's actually more important than making money, it makes sense to look at something like solar where, in this particular map, if you look at the big red square, all those squares combined could power most of the world's energy needs with solar. There's an image here from the Chevron refinery fire. I happened to live in Berkeley when this happened, and fossil fuels are just so polluting, and a lot of the impacts to salmonids in this area actually have to do with pollution. So transitioning to solar makes a lot of sense for the tribe. It's in line with their values, and it's basically, the way I look at it, it's a flood that's coming that everybody's going to experience in one way or another, and the early adopters can gain the most economically from choosing to go solar and convert their fleet to electric sooner. Next slide, please. So the Nez Perce tribe has already installed a couple of fast charging stations. We received money from the VW air quality settlement to install these charging stations at our casinos, and we're part of creating a electrified transportation network. Next slide, please. But most importantly, we are in the middle of putting in hundreds of solar panels. So, here's Casey Mitchell at our Power On press conference, turning on the power to the solar system, and a bunch of the solar installers and their families are in the background of this image that, was in the Lewiston Tribune. And then here's a picture of the roof from the Boys and Girls Club showing several of the roofs that have solar panels on them now. The city center now has enough solar to be its own microgrid, and we're waiting for our Tesla power packs to arrive in order to make that system off grid. And then the wastewater treatment plant also has a solar array now that's ground mounted. The wastewater treatment plant has had a lot of trouble with power outages because of osprey nesting on the power lines, and also just, issues with dirty power. And so by having battery backup at the wastewater treatment plant, we avoid, the power going off and people having to stay up in the middle of the night during storms to make sure the power is on, but also, clean the power and make the power plant run more efficiently, or the wastewater treatment plant run more efficiently. Additional projects are planned. The senior center will have solar, the fish hatcheries will have solar, and other communities on the reservation will have solar panels within the next year or two. Next slide, please. I want to share this video that Revolution created about this solar project that kind of speaks to what it means to the community. Revolution, the tribe decided to use Revolution to install their solar system and to invest in themselves. This is something really different than what a lot of other tribes have done. Originally, we talked to Grid Alternatives to work with them to apply for DOE funding. And it might be possible that we'll ask DOE for funding in the future. But for this initial project, the tribe has some investors, and then they invested in themselves. And Revolution hired all tribal members for this project and trained them. So this video will show them speaking about the project in their own words.
Somebody commented that when Lewis and Clark first came here, they said the fish were so thick in the river that they could almost walk across the river on the backs of the fish. I would love to see our salmon back like that.
My name is Chantel Green. I am the former vice chairman of the Nez Perce Tribe Executive Committee. We had originally started out with a partnership actually between myself and the climate change coordinator, Stephanie Krantz.
When I first started this job, the tribe had just been through this horrible drought and fish kill and wildfire situation. One of the first things that we did was do surveys to understand what the community really wanted. The number one thing that people said that they wanted was renewable energy. And the number two thing that they said was they wanted protection for water and education.
Yeah, so Stephanie Krantz and I were involved in a smart energy group program headquartered in Boise, Idaho. And we were sitting in our umpteenth meeting for the year with this group and other groups, and going in and out of governor's offices and senators' offices, and we realized it was just a lot of meetings and a lot of talk. And I texted her in the middle of the meeting and I said, "Are you tired of talking?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Let's make something happen."
It is hard to understate the impacts of climate change to tribal members. It impacts salmon, and the Nimipu are salmon people.
Within a week, we were sitting down with Chantel Green, the vice chairman of the tribe.
The partnership developed into the direction that we decided to take for solar energy.
We're going to act. We're tired of talking, and let's put some panels on some roofs. One of our goals when we came here was to hire tribal members to do the installation.
To hire all tribal staff to do the work, to build the capacity here to do more solar projects, having meaningful work where they're doing something about a problem that's affecting the things that they care about the most is really healing.
My name is Vernon Holt. I lived in Lapway, almost all my life. At first, I didn't want to do it because I'm kind of afraid of heights, but I started getting used to it, and then after that, I just started flying through it. And
I was actually in the mountains hunting, and my uncle called me. He's like, "Get down here." He's like, "Last day they're hiring," so I drove down here and got the job. But
I was a drafter before, so I did designs for solar in the past.
I came out here kind of expecting to be on a labor job, but I found out that I was actually being trained for any profession I wanted in solar panel industry.
I actually wanted to start my own business, and a friend sent me an email that they were looking for people to do solar install, so I'd figure I'd try it out, and before I actually went to school for it, see if I liked it.
I was excited to be here every day on the job, and it seems like every day we've kind of are learning something new out here.
I'd like to see panels on homes and be free from all this financials.
When I got on the project, I really bought on to the project manager's vision, and because I also advocate for dam removal.
I love the idea of, going green and clean renewable energy, which is, the future is going to be anyways, so you might as well get on it now.
The best case scenario, as far as I'm concerned, is if the tribe was not only self-sufficient, but that they could have their own utility company.
Hopefully expect some more training, more education, and more panels to put up.
I hope that we do end up starting a company and there'll be more employment for people here on the reservation.
It's definitely worthwhile. But just going off our own power, I like that.
It would be a bigger income than the casino, and that income fluctuates. If we had our own electrical company, that income wouldn't fluctuate, and it would be huge for the tribe and all the tribal members.
This is something that I see the tribe setting precedent for other tribes to do, as well as renewable energy and taking our power back.
It's good that we're outside working, but the other part, we're actually doing something good for the environment, for our people, and yeah, if the jobs keep coming in, I would definitely stick with it, and I'd encourage other people to get into it too.
It could also help with bringing back the fish, which is important to our cultural beliefs. We'd like to put in many panels and bring back many salmon.
It is long overdue that the tribe could take a leadership role in providing an alternative energy source to replace hydropower, because that's what we're fighting now.
If they could just see the vision of where this can go, the opportunity, I would like to see that people get invested in it emotionally, not just financially, and back it. And even if it takes time, like it took years to go from the tent to building the new casino and the lodge, it could take years, but don't let it go. The opportunity is too huge.
Getting other tribes and other local economies to switch over their energy source will take time. It's not going to happen overnight. So
you do have the right partnerships and collaborations moving forward. That's where you can see these projects come into fruition, and now we are going to be the leading in energy storage and development on behalf of our tribes here in Idaho.
So, could you forward it to the next slide, please? For the Nez Perce people, they're always thinking about the past and thinking about future generations. And, they received pretty strong treaty rights because of the bravery and goodness of Chief Joseph and the other chiefs that fought to keep these lands in the hands of the people and to protect springs and access to hunting and fishing and gathering. And I think that from that video, you can still see that culture today. Next slide, please. What I like to say to people that don't really understand what's happening here is that the Nez Perce people are resilient. Their culture is incredibly beautiful, and these people are incredibly strong and determined. They've already survived incredible changes and difficulties and are determined to protect the things that matter the most to them. Next slide, please. Chief Joseph said, "I have heard talk and talk, but nothing is done. Good words do not last long unless they amount to something." And he also said, "The earth is the mother of all people, and all people should have equal rights upon it." This wisdom is timeless. When he surrendered at Big Hole, he said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And, you know, Tuck Miller likes to think about that quote, the project leader from Revolution, because it's like the sun is the end of the fighting. And the sun can power a future that's hopeful. Next slide, please. So I just want to say thank you for listening, Katsiyaoyao. And thank you to Revolution, to Tuck Miller, to Chantel Green, to all of the installers, to our investors and funders, and to the Nez Perce Tribe Executive Committee and the BIA Tribal Resilience Program. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Sorry, I had myself on mute. Excellent presentation as well. A lot of interesting stuff there. Really cool cultural perspective you provided in your presentation. So thanks for bringing that to our audience. With that, we have time for question and answer. So please do submit your written questions, and we'll have time to get to them. I guess I would say that it sounds like some people did have some issues with the video in terms of either seeing it or hearing the audio from it. So there's a link in Stephanie's slide deck, so you can watch it once those are posted online. With that, let's jump into some questions. Eliza, that there was some interest in one of the early maps you showed. It had outages on it, and the number of outages in different regions of the United States and the duration of those outages. Can you either say where that map came from or how people could maybe access that data?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I apologize for not including the source of that map on the slide. I'll put that link in the chat, James, so that people can access that.
Great, thank you. A question for Jana. It sounded like you had maybe 3 microgrids in the community. Can you discuss either why there's 3 and not 1, or the advantages of doing multiple smaller microgrids over one larger community-based one?
Sure, that's a great question. Part of it is that, you know, we started building microgrids back in the ancient times of 2014, 2015. And at that time, the technology was pretty novel. And I think that our initial microgrid, the community microgrid, was the first of its kind to incorporate variable renewable resources with battery storage, with legacy diesel generators to serve a built environment. So not something that we created from scratch, but we had to put that whole thing around what was already there. And so we have, for these projects, we have tapped into the California Energy Commission's Research and Development Fund that is specifically interested in how microgrids can best be developed cost effectively, resiliently. And our projects have come out of different funding cycles and different areas of interest within that microgrid investment strategy by the state of California. So that's part of it, that we did approach it project by project because microgrid technology at the time was new. We had several facilities and campus environments that we could tackle, and by doing it kind of in phases with discrete projects, it was manageable for us. Now, fast forward to today, some of the benefits that have come out of that is that we now know that we have a diversified and separate portfolio of microgrids that if one fails, and energy systems do fail, the other one will can provide the lifeline sectors. So having separate systems, or the ability to keep your system separate, can be important from just a resilient standpoint. If one goes down for some reason, you still have the other one functioning. At the same time, we are actively, and our latest project is to look for ways to connect the microgrids together, and in ways that still preserve that ability to disconnect them if we need to, so that we can load shed and load shift, so reduce our energy use and shift it around more in a more coordinated fashion. And that does a couple things for us. Number one, it helps us achieve maybe more economies of scale with the control systems. Two, it helps us incorporate building systems, like we're increasingly electrifying our big power users like HVAC systems and that kind of thing in our big buildings. But also, as we increasingly electrify transportation, we can wrap that infrastructure into the microgrids in a more coordinated way as well. And when the grid needs these systems to act in a certain way, either reducing consumption or in some cases increasing consumption, when we have, say, too much solar production, we can make those things happen in a more coordinated way across multiple systems. So this is obviously an area of ongoing innovation, but the way that we've been able to make it work economically, and I think really create some good lessons learned and some good direction for how to build microgrids, is by partnering with the state, our university, our utilities, to really knowledge share about all of these systems and the way they work.
Excellent, thanks, Jana. In terms of that, the state funding, I forget what it's called now, but is that still available? Is that a recurring opportunity for the state of California or tribes within it?
Yeah, so there are 109 federally recognized tribes in California, and dozens of non-federally recognized tribes. The California Energy Commission has a substantial investment in research and development. Tribal lands, tribal nations, tribal communities are increasingly listed as specific areas of interest to deploy these systems for, equity purposes, to solve historic energy access issues. And the name of the funding is the Electric Program Investment Charge, or EPIC. And they're going through their next kind of look ahead to their investment plan for EPIC. And so if tribes are interested to go on the CEC's website and take a look at that, if you have the time or the inclination, just to do research into what they're looking to invest in. One of the things that's coming up soon is long-term battery storage. So the existing battery technologies we have are great, but we need to extend the length of the time that those battery systems can deliver power, and that's one of the EPIC investments that's coming up, and the funding opportunity will be out, I think, relatively soon.
Okay. Excuse me. Great. Thanks, Jana. Just to FYI to our audience, if you look in the chat function on the control panel, we've sent out both links to the NESPERS video as well as a link to the requested map from Eliza's presentation. Another question for you, Jana. With the microgrids and the community, did you need to get community buy-in? If so, how did you, generate that buy-in? And I guess talk more about your interactions with the community in developing these microgrids.
Yeah. Yes. The answer is yes. We had to get community buy-in, and we had to get buy-in and really a long runway for these projects from tribal council, tribal leadership, and then it was important to, as they say, socialize, but really it was important to get buy-in from division leaders within the tribe on the economic enterprise side and internally within the governmental department programs. And we did that in a number of ways. We had through various planning efforts, such as a community economic development strategy, or CEDS, that was funded by the Economic Development Administration, that work, a strategic energy plan and climate action plan, which allowed us to go out and conduct interviews in the same way that we heard Stephanie describe for the NESPERS. And then most recently, we've worked energy resilience and the climate context into our FEMA hazard mitigation plan, and that was a real important way to get all of the tribal leadership and all of the kind of career staff folks on board with the sense of urgency around these things through a series of discussions we had on that. Now the Blue Lake Rancheria is small, so our ability to conduct these things is much more feasible than many tribal nations who are much larger. So there's, that's always a caveat that I'll be quick to say. But these energy resilience programs really span into different things that we consider them the economy enabling infrastructure that supports the tribe's economic enterprises, like casino and hotel and the gas station convenience store and event center and all of these other things. They are investments in social services to provide lower costs than business as usual, and then emergency services. And then obviously it creates a bunch of other benefits that really resonate with tribal leadership, like education, workforce development, career opportunities, business development, and those kinds of things, which we also heard from Stephanie as well. Oh, and plus tribal council liked the lower electrical bills a lot.
Yeah, that's always a benefit, isn't it? Another question, or another question, I guess, related to natural gas. This tribe, and I'm not sure which tribe it is, but they are looking at clustering houses and doing microgrids to serve, small groups of homes, and they're wondering if anybody has thoughts on natural gas generation versus either, I don't know what the alternative would be, but maybe diesel or something like that. Do you have thoughts on that from a resiliency standpoint? Either, well, I guess anybody from the panel.
This is Jana. I'll keep it short, but we're actively moving away from natural gas-based systems for a number of reasons. One, it's just the reality that our natural gas supply is not something that we can count on. While actual outages have been infrequent in the natural gas system, we have seen, as most people with natural gas systems have seen, leaks and evacuations and those kinds of things in our area. Plus, we know that it's seismically vulnerable. If there's one pipeline, it's just those kinds of things really drive our decision making. The other thing is that tribal energy development does not happen in a vacuum. And as much as tribes do and will continue to exert sovereignty over their energy strategies, federal regulation and federal direction will play a part. And while it's been chaotic, to say the least, over the last 10 years about that direction, because of the expense and the hazards associated with climate change, the Blue Lake Rancheria is looking ahead to the day when, natural gas is phased out, as Stephanie sort of showed in her one of her graphics there. And so we don't want to base our resilient energy systems on something that is, from a policy standpoint, plus from a technical infrastructure standpoint, somewhat shaky. And if you're looking, from our experience for resilience and cost, solar and battery storage, or solar and wind and battery storage, are the lowest cost systems to develop from scratch. And and they are very easy to operate and maintain for the most part, depending on how complicated the installation is. And so for those reasons, we are big proponents of community scale solar, storage, wind, and those kinds of energy solutions.
Jana, I'd like to add to that too, that, for the Nez Perce tribe, it doesn't really make sense to develop natural gas resources because, first of all, they're limited. We don't have good natural gas resources here. It's better to go with micro hydro, solar, or wind in this case, but also the way natural gas is currently extracted in Idaho involves fracking, and there's a lot of impacts with fracking to the climate, including the release of methane, and then of course there's huge impacts to underground water supplies and a huge risk, especially in seismically active areas. Fracking itself has caused earthquakes, and so when there's a less expensive alternative and better ways to heat and cool homes, it doesn't really make sense to go that direction at this point. But also natural gas is a limited source of energy, whereas solar, wind, and water is not limited. And then alongside that, I really focused on the fish story here because it's the reason why the tribe is going this direction, but we're looking at all sorts of other types of resilience issues. Like, for instance, Chantel Green, who is going to present in, I think, October for the DOE, is looking at sustainable housing designs that would allow us to get tribal members into safer homes that are, have less toxins within them because of the nature of the building materials, but also are less likely to burn up in forest fires. It's simply impossible to replace all the buildings that have burned down in these forest fires in the West with timber framed houses because it's just so much wood. And so it makes more sense to use materials that are more readily available, that are locally available, that are earth-based, that are safer for fire management. And then, another thing that I've thought a lot about is that during these forest fires, the transmission lines and the gas lines and the, propane tanks have been a source of fuel for the fires that have made things worse in communities. And so going that direction is not as resilient as having off-grid situations or wood-based situations, et cetera. Yeah, so I think, if we're going to start and look to a sustainable future, we really have to focus on things that are safe in all ways, are safe for public health, are safe during forest fires, are reliable and renewable. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. You mentioned in your presentation that the intent is to install power walls at some of the facilities that have where you've installed solar. Is the intention that those community buildings would be isolated from the grid then, or is the intent just to have the ability to provide power in the case of grid outages?
Well, it's interesting in this situation because there are several things going on here. The local power company did not want to net meter for us initially, and basically we said, well, we can just run the system on the back end then and not be connected to the grid. And I don't think that they were really aware that it was possible now to have your own system and your own power. And so, ultimately they chose to net meter for the tribe in exchange for us providing them with power during power outages or during peak power demand. And then the wastewater treatment plant in particular is a vulnerable facility when it comes to extreme events, and we want to make sure that it always has power. So that facility is going to be off grid. And then the solar panels in the central part of town basically can power all of the government operations, and they're connected to the community center and the Boys and Girls Club, both of which are really important for emergency management. They can both be air quality shelters and heat shelters and evacuation centers. And so keeping those powered in such a way that they can be off grid is really important for emergency management. And I know the tribe would also like to do the same thing for the casino. If there's a major evacuation, the casino has rooms and the ability to house a lot of people and gathering areas that help with emergency management. But, the tribe has had forest fires burn down cell towers, has had disruptions of communications, et cetera. And so we're looking at other systems as backups, including radio, et cetera. It's more than I could possibly cover in a single presentation. And I think Jana did a great job of just putting all of the different things that they're doing together. But, many people at the tribe are working on these kinds of resilience issues and including it in our hazards mitigation planning. And so the goal is to have these centers that can be powered off grid in multiple communities across the reservation, so that if there's an evacuation or if there's roads that get cut off, that multiple places will be able to respond, because we're really spread out.
Understood. Thanks, Stephanie, for the context around that. We've gone over in terms of our allotted time. There's one more question that just came in, so I'll ask that, but then we'll need to move on. Question here about small modular nuclear reactors, and I've heard about the potential use of these in Alaska, previously discussed. Is that something that either Blue Lake Rancheria or Nez Perce or Eliza in your resiliency planning circles are considered as a source of generation for isolated areas or a way to power microgrids?
This is Jana. This is something that I feel really strongly about based on a regional situation here. As I mentioned in my presentation, we have a nuclear waste storage facility. It was actually the first commercial nuclear plant. It was a small one. It was supposed to be a small modular one in the way, not the same technology, but I think in the contextual way that we're thinking about small nuclear modular systems now. It cost about $33 million to build in the 50s and 60s. It shut down decades before its plan because of economics. And to date, it's at $1.02 billion and counting to clean it up and safely store that nuclear waste. With no plan, really no feasible plan to solve for that issue. So I want to hear what Stephanie and Eliza say about this, but I would say that we have technologies that are so much easier, safer, and do not create this perpetual safety and economic lodestone around communities that are potentially under-resourced as it is. To manage the solar and battery storage systems that we have at Blue Lake Rancheria, we don't need nuclear physicists for that. And I would just caution that the nuclear waste profile has not changed, and the conversation definitely seems to glide over the waste and the expense and the capacity needed to manage these kinds of systems, which it just, at the end of the day, seems to me from my chair too hard. What's easy or easier are systems that we have that are very cost effective and within reach technically and from a capacity standpoint. And with that, I'll turn it over to my fellow panelists.
Perhaps your answer covered it. With that, let's just wrap up the webinar, because I know many of us have additional responsibilities here. First off, I want to thank our panelists today. A bunch of excellent presentations, some really good material in there. So thank you so much for your time preparing those. To our audience, we are interested in your suggestions on how to strengthen the value of this training, so please do send us any feedback that you have. Our final slideshow, or our final slide here, shows the remaining webinars of the 2021 series. The next webinar is titled Microgrids for Resilient Electricity Systems. It will be held on June 30th at the same time, 11 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. Thanks to our audience for your interest and attendance, and thanks to our panelists for your contributions. We look forward to the audience joining us for future webinars. This concludes our webinar for today. Good day.
Thank you, James. Thank you, speakers. Goodbye.